Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and this is my review of episode 9 of season 3 of Star Trek Strange New Worlds, called Enemy Mine. Sorry, actually that's an old movie, but it might as well have been called Enemy Mine, because it's an almost exact one-to-one duplicate of that movie, and it's not the first time that Star Trek used that exact same idea. There were a few episodes very similar to that, especially the Enterprise episode Dawn, which was very similar, and also in TNG there was the episode The Enemy, in which LaForge was trapped with a Romulan on a planet and they had to cooperate and work together and then became friends by the end. And even the episode Darmok was kind of similar, even though it added all kinds of new things. And so that's what a good remake should do. It shouldn't just be an exact copy. If you're doing a ripoff, at least make it better in some way, at least add something to it. And in New Trek, oftentimes they kind of borrow the same old ideas and remake them, but they don't even do it in any better way. And so what's the point? If they're not improving anything, I might as well just rewatch the old movie again. Also, it kind of annoyed me how in the beginning of the episode they showed a recap from previous episodes, and they showed that part when Ortega was attacked by Gorn, and so that immediately kind of spoiled the whole episode to me, because I immediately knew that it's going to be a Gorn on that planet, because why would they show that otherwise? And at least they finally did something with that idea. This is something I've been complaining ever since they showed the Gorn on this show. They always showed them as being like xenomorph monsters. It's like they're pure evil, and I constantly said that's against the Star Trek idea, and it contradicts what we saw in TOS. So at least they finally correct that. They finally show us that not all Gorn are pure evil, and that we can reason with them and talk with them and make peace with them and all of it. But it all felt kind of rushed in this episode. So when she meets that Gorn on that planet, they kind of immediately become best friends right away. And so that felt kind of too quick of a change. Like, they should have shown them fighting for a bit in the beginning, then start to cooperate to survive, and then become friends, just like it was in that old movie. And yet here the Gorn is pure good right away. The Gorn is totally good-hearted right from the start and saves Ortega right away. And so that felt kind of too rushed, and also Ortega herself kind of became too trusting too soon, because did she forget that the Gorn on the show use humans to breed, that they lay eggs in them to reproduce? And so why didn't she think maybe the Gorn is saving her for later for that purpose? And yet that thought never occurred to her at all, so that was also kind of strange. So there are a lot of details I'm going to nitpick, but at least the overall idea is finally Star Trek-ish. Finally, it's about something. And you know, this whole season of the show felt kind of gimmicky, like almost every episode was some kind of silly idea for the sake of comedy, and they barely did any actual stories, so at least it's about something. And now let's get to the details. And so Ortega is going to fly a shuttle to investigate some strange gravity anomaly. And it's funny how the Enterprise later in the episode is said to urgently be needed to deliver some vaccines to some colonists who are dying from a plague, and they have to get the vaccines right away. So wait a second, if they were so urgently needed to deliver these vaccines, why do they send Ortega on this dangerous mission right before that? Like, why take the chance of something going wrong if you're so urgently needed in some other place? If they kind of found out about it after they sent her on the mission, then it would make sense, but they never said that. They said as if they knew about it already, so that makes it ridiculous. Also, why does it always have to be about vaccines in this show? Like, they mentioned vaccines numerous times in previous episodes. Can't they come up with some other emergency, like maybe a planet is about to be wiped out by an asteroid collision or something that the Enterprise is needed? The Enterprise might be the fastest ship in range, something like that. So that will put a timer on this episode of how long they can stay and look for Ortega, but instead it's to deliver vaccines to save people from a plague. So what's with the show's obsession about vaccines? And I'm not against vaccines, but it's kind of getting ridiculous how every time it's a vaccine they have to deliver. Like, why not invent some other reason that you have to rush to some planet to save it? And there was also a quick mention of the USS Constellation and Captain Decker. He was the captain from the TOS episode about the Doomsday Machine. Also, they kind of forgot that in Star Trek they always use the metric system, because Ortega keeps saying ounces instead of grams, and so that annoyed me a little bit. And then she takes a shuttle, which they specifically said was stripped of anything non-essential because it's going to some gravity field or something, so they had to modify it to better handle it. and then a wormhole suddenly appears and the shuttle gets sucked into it and appears in some other place, in which once again we see a whole bunch of debris floating all over the place. That's something I complained about in my previous review, that all the time they show us that space is really cluttered with planets and debris everywhere, and at least they used my excuse, exactly what I suggested in my previous review. At least make it plausible, say that it's all orbiting a gas giant or something, and that's exactly the excuse in this episode, that there are hundreds of moons around this gas giant, and that's why it's all looking so cluttered. And so at least there is some kind of plausible excuse. And so she crashes on one of those moons, and it happens to have breathable air, or breathable-ish, as she said, because they always have to add an ish in the end of sentences in New Trek. And then they show us that all the food rations were destroyed, and later the whole shuttle gets sucked out. And so they had like 3 different excuses for why she doesn't have enough supplies in this episode. So they said previously that they removed anything non-essential from the shuttle, then they show us that all the rations were burned, and then later they show the whole shuttle crashes down and she cannot reach it. And so what was the point of multiple different excuses for the same problem? So she has no food, basically. That's why she has to go out and explore this moon, which somehow is breathable. And then she sees some kind of tent in the distance and decides to go to it. So once again, they forgot all about the Prime Directive. How does she know it's not some indigenous intelligent life form? So she's not allowed to contact it and come with it with all her technology. And she does carry a tricorder. And when she scans the sky, she determines that the orbit of this moon is unstable, that is going to get too close to the atmosphere of that gas giant, and she's going to suffocate. They don't say exactly how long, but it's implied she's been there at least a day or 2 on that moon, and she's already starving. She cannot wait in the shuttle for a few days, and she found a way to make water. And by the way, she suddenly becomes MacGyver in this episode. Suddenly she can turn rocks into replicators and build whatever she wants, and so that was also a little bit ridiculous. At least they kind of foreshadowed that in that previous episode with that documentary. They did show that Ortega is good at building stuff, so at least it doesn't come completely out of the blue. But it's kind of ridiculous that she can literally build anything she needs from scraps in a cave, I guess. And so she's just such a genius, and she built a device that can make water from the air, but she still needs food, and she only didn't eat for 1 day and she's already starving. And so she goes over to that tent, and then it's revealed it's a Gorn, which was no surprise to me because they kind of spoiled it in the beginning of the episode by showing that recap about her being attacked by the Gorn. I immediately knew it's going to be an enemy mine situation. So that kind of spoiled the surprise, and the Gorn immediately is good. The Gorn immediately doesn't want to kill her, even though Ortega basically attacks it, but the Gorn doesn't become hostile and leaves her alone, and even tries to feed her with those centipods that it's taken out of the ground to eat. And then Ortega immediately also starts eating it. And she doesn't even use her tricorder, which we saw that she does have a tricorder, but she doesn't use it to check if it's actually poisonous for her to eat this centipede, because even here on Earth we have all kinds of insects that if we eat them we get poisoned with their venom, and yet it's an alien moon and she doesn't bother to check if it's okay for her to eat. She just starts eating it right away. And again, it's not as if she's been here for weeks or months. It was only 1 or 2 days. So why is she so starving she's able to eat this nasty stuff? And it doesn't make sense. Why is the Gorn so nice right away? I guess it was lonely because it was there for a while. How exactly was the Gorn able to survive when the orbit of that moon comes too close to the gas giant, as they said that it's going to be so poisonous? I guess that personal shield that the Gorn has also protected it from that time when it was too close to the gas giant, I guess. So Ortega realized that this Gorn is good and not bad, and so she becomes best buddies with it right away. And that kind of annoyed me because we've seen previously on the show that the Gorn use humans as breeding sex to lay eggs in them, just like the xenomorph. And Ortega knows that, so why doesn't she suspect that's the reason the Gorn might be saving her up for later? She doesn't even think about that, so that also annoyed me. And she notices that the Gorn is injured and is treating its wound, and that kind of reminded me of that scene in Star Wars 9, when Rey got stuck in a cave with some kind of giant snake and noticed that it was injured, and then she heals that snake, and then the snake helps her out, and so that also reminded me of that. And Ortega is able to build a universal translator from scraps, but it's only able to say basically yes or no, agree or disagree. And yet the Gorn is able to understand her fully. It's kind of implied it's because the Gorn studied English, because they studied their enemy, something like that. So the Gorn is able to understand her, and now Ortega is able to hear the Gorn saying yes or no. So I wonder, did Ortega later design that chair that Pike will be in? Because he also was only able to say yes or no. So maybe Ortega designed that for him later, because that's the extent of her abilities. So they're now able to communicate, and then the first question Ortega asks the Gorn is it male? And then it says no, that it's a female. So that kind of made me laugh, because why is that the first thing on Ortega's mind? And also, didn't they show that the Gorn in this show don't really reproduce like us? Instead, they're basically like parasites. They lay their eggs in other creatures and so on. And so did they forget all about it? So suddenly the Gorn are male and female like us? And maybe only the males are able to impregnate other species. Maybe that's why Ortega is so relaxed and not thinking about that whole scenario, that maybe the Gorn is keeping her to breed with her and all of it. So once she heard it's a female, she completely calms down. And then she teaches the Gorn to play chess with a bunch of rocks. And so all these rocks look exactly the same, so how exactly do they play chess with it? And it's unclear exactly how much time passed. And maybe they should have said that that wormhole created some kind of temporal dilation effect or something, that she actually spent a lot of time on that planet while it was only one day for the Enterprise. Something like that would be more clever, and also would explain how suddenly they're best friends and best buddies and know how to play chess, as if it's been months that they've been together, while it's only been one day. And the Gorn keeps giving her pieces of those centipedes to eat, and Ortega finally remembers that she has a device that is able to create fire. And it's funny how it has the Starfleet logo on it. And that's also something that we constantly see in New Trek, that everything has the Starfleet symbol on it. Their uniforms, their boots, and every single device they have has the Starfleet logo. So it kind of reminds me of the bat symbol in Batman, which is in every one of his gadgets, even on his credit card. So Starfleet apparently now watermarks every single piece of equipment they have. Maybe it's deliberate, so that if they forget something on some alien planet, they'll be able to know it's theirs or something. So maybe there is an in-universe reason, but it's kind of getting ridiculous that even the whole of that device that is creating the flame looks like the Starfleet symbol. Meanwhile, the Enterprise keeps looking for her, and they're in such an emergency to get to that planet to deliver vaccines, and so they cannot look for her for long. And Uhura constantly pushes everyone to save Ortega at all costs, because that's her best friend, I guess. And at some point she even falsifies some of the scientific data to convince Pike to do that, because Pike said something about needing at least 60% of their sensors or something to continue, and then she falsifies the data and shows him fake data so that he will agree to continue the search. And later in the episode, she's about to admit it to him, and she realizes that she's endangering the whole ship. And then Pike tells her, oh, I knew that you faked it, I knew it all about it, but I was still going to save her anyway, and it's okay to lie if it's for a good cause, something like that. He didn't specifically say it was okay, but he kind of forgave her for the violation. And so that, I will add that to my very long list of all the times that everyone on the show keeps violating orders or falsifying their logs and records and lying to their superiors and all of it. And so Pike is completely fine with that in the end. He completely forgives her. So I guess it's okay, because he's been doing that himself multiple times in this season. He lied to his superiors, he falsified records, and so why does he surprise when his subordinates who saw all of that when he did it, that they will also do that to him? And also he has no discipline with his crew. They always do whatever they want and disregard him, so he's kind of not even surprised anymore. And so he tells her, oh, I knew you falsified that data, but that's okay, because it's for a good reason of saving your friend. I would have saved her anyway. So why did you say 60% if you would have done it, even if it was 50? So why did you force her to do that? Did you just want to see if she'll do it or not? And then you don't even tell her that you knew until she came to admit it. So is he actively trying to encourage this kind of behavior? So why are there no consequences or a punishment, at least symbolically in the end, that you did something wrong and so it was for a good reason, but it's still wrong, and so I'm still going to punish you by putting you in the brig for 2 weeks, something like that, to establish some kind of authority, some kind of discipline on the ship. But no, Pike is totally fine with Uhura falsifying the records, and isn't that endangering the whole ship and also those colonists they keep talking about, who would have all died just to save one person? And so at least they did raise that issue. Should we sacrifice thousands of colonists to save one person, and so on? So in the end, they take the entire ship into the wormhole, to hold it open for Ortega because the wormhole was collapsing. So, but if they put the entire ship in the middle and activate a static warp shell, once again some strange technobubble to make whatever they want to happen, and so they're able to hold the wormhole open while they scan all the moons of that gas giant. And then Ortega somehow knows magically that this is the right moment to signal to the Enterprise to find her, and so she decides to ignite the entire atmosphere. And at that point of the episode, they also no longer have that shield I mentioned, that personal shield of the Gorn stopped working. So they put some pieces of metal from the Gorn's shuttle or something and just put them together like Spartan shields. And that's how they're able to survive it when Ortega ignites the entire atmosphere. And I'm not exaggerating, that's what they showed us. They literally show us the entire atmosphere of that moon burning completely. And yet, because they hid behind some metal shield, that's totally okay. They totally were able to survive it, so there was no shockwave, and there is still oxygen despite of it afterwards, and so somehow they magically survive when the entire atmosphere was seen to be blowing up, and the Enterprise is able to see them, and so they beam an away team to that moon, which includes La'an, and at least we have some kind of payoff for that scene in that documentary episode when La'an said that sometimes it's necessary to shoot first and ask questions later, which I kind of poked fun at. And now she goes down to this moon and she sees Ortega in a Gorn, and then she immediately shoots the Gorn. And then Ortega shouts, "No!" and the Gorn dies. And that kind of reminded me of the ending of the Deep Space Nine episode Duet, in which Kira learned that not every Cardassian is evil. And there was a scene when Samba Joran killed her new Cardassian friend, and then Kira says, "Why?" So it really reminded me of that, and I half expected La'an to say, "It's because it's a Gorn. That's reason enough." So that was kind of funny. And also Ortega apparently has some ESP abilities because she's able to sense that someone else is watching her. So all across the episode she kind of saw all kinds of strange lights in the sky and she didn't know what that is, and she kept saying that I sense as if someone is watching. And then in the end, after the Gorn dies, she suddenly shouts at the sky, "Show yourself, reveal yourself to me." And then La'an is thinking she probably went nuts, and so she calls for a beam out. And suddenly time stops in the middle of the transport, and only Ortega is aware of it. And then we see something appearing in front of her, and I immediately knew it's going to be the Metrons, who we first saw in the original series when Kirk spared the Gorn. And then a Metron appeared in front of him because he's been watching the whole thing. At least there, Kirk knew about it from the beginning. He knew that the Metrons were setting it up, basically. But in this episode, Ortega had no way of knowing that, so she somehow sensed it. She knew that someone set up that wormhole. They kept implying that it's impossible not to be able to detect a wormhole. And she saw those strange lights, and she somehow knew that someone is watching. So my guess is that she has a really high midichlorian count. Maybe that's why she's such a good pilot, because she has ESP. So then the Metron appeared before her. The mannerisms of the Metron kind of made me laugh, because it does strangely fit what we saw in TOS, because the Metron we saw there was also, as described by Kirk, looking like a boy and not a man. So the one we see in this episode looks and behaves and sounds kind of feminine. And so I guess when you get more evolved as a species, you become much more feminine, I guess. And so the Metron tells her how disappointed he is in humanity, that they are not yet ready to meet them because they are too violent and all of that. And he implies that they will do this test again in the future. So that is kind of a setup to the TOS episode when the Metrons once again pitted a Gorn and a human against each other to see what will happen. So that's their hobby, I guess, to play with Gorn and humans as if they're chess pieces. And there was one interesting line when he told Ortega that maybe next time we will alter your perception of the Gorn, something like that. So does that imply that maybe that Gorn we saw in TOS was modified by the Metrons to look more humanoid? Maybe so it will be a fair fight between him and Captain Kirk. That's actually a theory I raised in a previous review when I discussed the Gorn. One of my possible excuses to explain away the differences of the Gorn we see in this show and the one we saw in TOS was that maybe because the one we saw in TOS was pitted against Kirk deliberately by the Metrons, who are super advanced, maybe they deliberately modified that Gorn. So the way they said it here is kind of vague, so it's not necessarily the explanation, but it is implied that maybe they will physically modify either the Gorn itself or the perception of a human of a Gorn, so that it will look different in our minds, and so maybe that's one possible way to explain the differences. And then in the end, the Metron tells Ortega that he's going to erase her memory of encountering him. And so what's the point of talking with her if you're going to erase her memory of this conversation anyway? So what was the point? Also, the Metron told Ortega that he makes himself look like that. So I guess their true form is some kind of energy creature, as all the advanced aliens become non-corporeal at some point. And so he makes himself look like that for her benefit. So how come the one that Kirk saw was also so similar? I guess the original idea in the original episode was that it should look like an angel, that maybe the angels from our legends were actually aliens who visited humanity, and so we saw them as angels, and so I guess that's kind of the idea of that. And yet here the Metron says that he's taking the form of something that she will accept, something like that. So it's all kind of vague, but I did like that special effect of stopping time in the middle of the transport. That's something we didn't see before, and so that was kind of cool in a way. And I guess it makes sense, since even someone like Wesley is able to freeze time because he became a traveler, and so obviously more advanced aliens would also be able to do that. And what I wish they would have done in this episode is say that there was some kind of time dilation, that Ortega spent a lot more time with that Gorn than the time that the Enterprise spent looking for her. That would have made that bond and friendship between her and the Gorn much more believable if we saw some kind of montage that a lot of time passed. And now I guess Ortega will have to deal with La'an, and that she killed her other best friend by shooting first without asking questions, and so I wonder if it will ever raise up, or if she'll just forgive her right away. I guess we'll wait and see. And there's only one more episode left for this whole season. And so even if that episode will be amazing, I will still say this whole season was the weakest season of the show so far, because very few episodes were actually about something. So at least this one did have some morality and ethical questions to debate. And so at least it felt like it's about something. And that's why I would put this episode as above average for this season, but that still doesn't say much, because the rest of the season was mostly terrible. So this is just slightly above average, but not by much. That's my opinion. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time.